In a world where life is precious, a black nurse faces unimaginable challenges. Pressured by a demanding doctor, she battles microaggressions and the shadow of racism in the workplace. But everything changes when she finds herself caring for the man who underestimates her, and a tragedy triggers a battle for the truth. Amid the pressure and emotional loneliness, she must find the courage to stand up and fight. Discover how one woman can change the fate of many, even when the world seems to conspire against her. The corridors of São Miguel Hospital were a maze of haste and uncertainty. With steady steps, Helena Duarte navigated her way through the gurneys and emergency rooms, her clean white uniform standing out amid the chaos. It was another long night, and she knew that, as in so many others, tiredness and pressure would be her constant companions. Helena was an experienced nurse, but the atmosphere of the hospital weighed heavily on her shoulders. Every beep from the monitors and every scream that echoed off the walls reminded her that, although she was there to provide care, she often felt invisible. The gazes of the doctors quickly passed her by, as if her presence didn't matter. It hurt her more than any physical wound she had ever treated. She adjusted the badge on her chest and took a deep breath before entering the emergency room. As she entered, a group of doctors were discussing a patient in critical condition, but Helena noticed that her suggestions and observations were met with disdain. "Helena, have you checked on the patient in room 204? Dr. Lucas Guerra asked, his tone authoritative, as if the mere fact that she was there demanded more than he was willing to give. "Yes, Dr. Lucas. Her vital signs are stable and her medication has been adjusted." Helena's voice was firm, but a slight tremor betrayed her insecurity. "Good. Maybe next time we can have something more efficient?" he replied, barely turning to look directly at her. The indifference in his words made Helena's heart squeeze. The feeling of not being heard followed her like a shadow. As soon as he left, Helena sat down in the nearby chair, feeling exhaustion set in. The conversation she'd heard and the words that hadn't been said were mixed up in her mind. Every time Dr. Lucas minimized her contributions, it was as if a part of her was devalued. This silent battle had gone on for months, and she wondered if one day she would have her moment of recognition. She tried to push these thoughts aside as she observed the nurses working around her. The heavy atmosphere of the hospital reflected her emotional loneliness. Helena, even surrounded by colleagues, felt isolated. When the break finally came, she sat alone in the cafeteria. The smell of coffee and home-cooked food was not enough to calm her restless spirit. Marissa, the head nurse, walked past her with a look that seemed to pass right through Helena, as if she wasn't really there. Another long night, she thought, looking out of the window. The dark sky reflected her emotional state. The challenges she was facing weren't just professional. They were personal, fraught with frustration and a constant sense of not belonging. Loneliness was deepening. And with it, doubt. What did Helena need in order to be seen? For her struggle to be recognized? The weight of these questions accompanied her, like a burden that seemed increasingly difficult to bear. The weeks passed, and each day brought new microaggressions that fed Helena's feelings of inadequacy. Each interaction seemed like a new opportunity for Dr. Lucas to make it clear that he saw her as a second-rate professional. And although he didn't use open words of contempt, the tone of his voice and the way he looked away when talking to her said it all. One particularly tiring morning, Helena was preparing the room for a new patient when Dr. Lucas walked in. He quickly examined the patient's chart before turning to her. "Helena, make sure the medications are all correct, okay?" he said, as if he were talking to an inexperienced trainee. "We don't want any more surprises." Sorrow ripped through her chest. "Yes, Dr. Lucas. I'm checking everything according to protocol," she replied, forcing a smile that barely reached her eyes. "Good. Since you seem to be so busy, I hope you won't forget to check the emergency room. The next patient could arrive any minute." The irony in his tone was palpable, and Helena felt the color of his face heat up with contained anger, as if his attention was anywhere but on his work. After he left, she stood paralyzed, staring at the closed door. The rest of the team was in the other room, and the energy of the place made her feel even more isolated. The laughter and chatter of her colleagues seemed a cruel contrast to the weight of the pressure she felt. In a break between appointments, Helena decided she needed to get something off her chest. Nurse Anna, a colleague who always had a supportive word, was nearby. They sat down at one of the cafeteria tables. "Anna, have you noticed how Dr. Lucas treats me?" Helena began, trying to control the tension in her voice. "I think he's a bit demanding with everyone, but well, you know how he is." Anna replied hesitantly. "Don't take it personally, okay?" Helena frowned. "It's not just that. It's like I'm always trying to prove something." Like I'm invisible. Anna hesitated, not knowing exactly what to say. Look, Helena, you're an excellent nurse. Don't let it get to you. He can be difficult. Difficult? He doesn't respect me? Helena said, her voice breaking. And the worst thing is that nobody seems to notice. Sometimes I wonder if it's worth going on like this. Yes, it is. You're great. Things will get better, believe me. Just keep your head up. Helena shook her head, but doubt still consumed her. As she walked back to the infirmary, the conversation with Anna echoed in her mind. What was wrong with her? Why couldn't she stand up for herself, even though she knew she had the necessary knowledge and experience? The days passed, and each new encounter with Dr. Lucas seemed to bring a new layer of disdain. Helena began to feel like a shadow accompanying him, always relegated to the background, always waiting for a chance to shine, but always ignored. Then, during a round, she overheard Dr. Lucas talking to another doctor. That nurse. She has potential, but I don't know if she's really ready to be a leader. She has to show more than just the protocols, you know? He said, laughing slightly. Those words cut Helena deeply. She was so tired of being underestimated, of being seen as an eternal apprentice. What more did she need to do to be recognized as a competent professional? At night, alone in her apartment, Helena allowed herself to cry. Frustration and sadness enveloped her. She wondered if she could hold out any longer in that toxic environment. Loneliness and insecurity were her most frequent companions, and with each passing day the doubt grew stronger. Would I ever be able to be seen and respected as I really was? The days turned into weeks, and Helena began to feel the weight of the pressure building up on her shoulders. Every morning, as she looked in the mirror, she noticed the dark circles under her eyes deepening and the sparkle in her eyes diminishing. The hospital, once a place of hope and healing, now seemed like a maze of tension and anxiety. On duty, Dr. Lucas' constant microaggressions and Marissa's indifference became a source of growing stress. When the nurses talked to each other, the laughter seemed distant and unapproachable, while Helena felt more and more like an intruder in a world that didn't accept her. The conversations around the cafeteria table were filled with plans and laughter, but Helena always stayed on the sidelines, listening but never really participating. At home, the situation wasn't much different. Paolo, her boyfriend, tried to be supportive, but often failed to understand the depth of the pain Helena felt. He often encouraged her to leave work at work and relax. For him, stress was just part of everyday life, but for Helena, it was a constant battle. One quiet evening, while they were trying to watch a movie together, Paul turned to her, worried. You seem distant, love. What's going on? Nothing, just tired, Helena replied, trying to hide the whirlwind of emotions that was consuming her. Tired? Or do you just not want to talk about what's really bothering you? He insisted, with an expression that mixed concern and frustration. She sighed, her eyes straying to the screen. It's not easy, Paolo. It's a very difficult environment and it's just work, Helena. You don't have to take it so seriously. Those words hit her like a stab. That's easy for you to say. You're not there, you don't feel the pressure of being constantly underestimated. It's not just work for me, it's my life. Silence filled the room and Helena realized she had crossed a line. Paul didn't answer and the tension between them increased. The fear that separation was a real possibility began to haunt her, but she felt so powerless to change her situation. That night, as she lay alone, Helena lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The whisper of insecurity became deafening. What if you're not good enough, she thought? What if it's all for nothing? The weight of her doubts grew, and she wondered if she would be able to stand firm in the midst of so much pressure. At work, the situation didn't improve. One day, after a complicated service, while reviewing a patient's notes, Helena overheard Marissa talking on the phone. Yes, we're having some problems with the team. Helena is a good nurse, but she still needs to learn to stand up for herself. Let's see what we can do about it, Marissa said, her carefree tone causing a knot in Helena's stomach. It was painful to hear those words, but at the same time, the certainty that her leadership and competence were being questioned made her even more frustrated. The fact that Marissa was talking about her instead of to her only fueled the feeling of exclusion. The nights became longer and loneliness became a constant. Every time Helena entered the hospital, her heart filled with anxiety. What awaited her? Another dose of disdain? Another day of feeling invisible? The internal battle between the desire to give up and the desire to fight for her dignity became more and more intense. One evening, after an exhausting shift, she decided to go for a walk on her own. She walked aimlessly through the streets, feeling the fresh wind on her face. Each step seemed lighter than her daily routine at the hospital, but even so, the weight of frustration accompanied her. It was as if, with every breath, she was trying to expel the pain that was building up in her chest. Helena sat on a park bench, observing the people around her. Couples laughing, children playing, and she sat there, immersed in her dark thoughts. It was as if an invisible wall separated her from the rest of the world. The idea of belonging seemed like a mirage, ever more distant. She pulled her cell phone out of her pocket, thinking about calling Anna, but hesitated. What could she say? That she felt lost? That she needed support? The fear of being seen as weak prevented her from taking action. So she just stood there, alone with her thoughts, unaware that this internal silence would bring her to breaking point. Finally, Helena got up and walked home, determined to face another day in hospital. But deep down she knew that something had to change. The emotional pressure was unbearable, and the loneliness made the struggle harder than it should have been. Doubt and insecurity were growing, and Helena wondered if she could find the strength to overcome it all. The next morning seemed to echo the despair of the night before. When Helena arrived at the hospital, the atmosphere was tense and information flowed quickly through the corridors. A rescue team had brought in a patient in critical condition, and everyone was on alert. What she didn't know was that the patient was actually Dr. Lucas. She was at her workstation when she heard the team's commotion. Dr. Lucas has been in a car accident and is here in the emergency room. The sound of nervous, hurried voices filled the room, and a wave of surprise and concern washed over Helena. She had never imagined that her boss, the man who underestimated her so much, could be in such a situation. Feeling a mixture of empathy and anxiety, Helena immediately went to the emergency room. As she entered, she found a team of doctors preparing to attend to the doctor. He was conscious, but pale and had a deep cut on his forehead, which was bleeding freely. Helena's heart raced when she saw him in that state. In an instant, rivalries and grievances dissolved into a sea of concern. "Dr. Lucas, can you hear me?" Helena asked, leaning over him. He stared at her, his eyes showing a mixture of confusion and pain. "Helena," he murmured, his voice weak. What happened?" "You've been in an accident, but we're here to look after you. Just relax," she said, trying to control the anxiety in her voice. While the medical team worked, Helena took the lead. She began to check vital signs, applying the protocols as competently as she always had, even when Dr. Lucas didn't give her credit. "I'm going to need you to stay calm, Dr. Lucas. You'll come out of this," she said, her voice now full of determination. The other doctors, realizing the seriousness of the situation, began to mobilize. Helena moved with confidence and precision, taking the lead in the team. Every action she took seemed to renew her confidence, a sense of control that had been lacking in recent weeks. Dr. Lucas looked at her, and she could see the surprise in his eyes, as if he was beginning to recognize her for the first time. After the initial stabilization, the team decided that he needed surgery. Helena remained by his side even after the team left, holding his hand. "You'll be fine, Dr. Lucas. You're strong," she encouraged him, and he looked at her with a silent gratitude that she couldn't put into words. What began as a normal day quickly turned into a fight for the doctor's life. Helena didn't move away even as the hours dragged on. She helped prepare the material, the organization, and, at an unexpected moment, she overheard a conversation that would change many people's perception of her. "Who's doing the emotional support?" "Helena seems to be doing very well," she heard a nurse comment about her. "Yes, she's a good nurse. We hope Dr. Lucas sees her like this afterwards," another voice said, and Helena felt a chill in her stomach. The idea that this might be her chance to be recognized for her skills drove her on. At that moment, the pressure of her job was overshadowed by the hope that people would start to see her as more than just an invisible nurse. When the surgery was finally over, and Dr. Lucas was taken to the recovery room, Helena sat down in the nearby chair, her heart racing. After a while, the door opened and the surgeon came out, his countenance serious. "He's stable, but he'll need intensive care for the next few hours. Helena, you were outstanding during the procedure. Great work." The surgeon's words were like a balm to Helena's soul. For the first time in a long time she felt recognized. She was there not just as a nurse but as someone who really made a difference. As the nursing staff began to enter the recovery room, Helena paused to observe Dr. Lucas, now asleep. There was something about the way he breathed that calmed her. The fragility of the situation revealed the humanity behind the authoritarian demeanor. What she didn't know was that, in that moment of vulnerability, a new dynamic was about to emerge. She could finally have the chance to transform others' perception of her. And in the midst of all the uncertainty, a seed of hope began to sprout in Helena's heart, even if she didn't know how it would all unfold. The hours dragged by as Helena waited in the recovery room. The silence was interrupted only by the beeping of the monitors and the distant murmur of conversations on the ward. She felt a mixture of relief and nervousness. The fact that Dr. Lucas was stable was an achievement, but her mind still wandered through the uncertainties that had always accompanied her. Around dawn, a new patient was brought into the hospital. He was a young man involved in a motorcycle accident, and his condition was critical. As soon as the emergency team started attending to him, Helena noticed the tension in the air. They needed to act fast. Dr. Lucas had been taken to the ICU to recover from surgery, but the medical team was under pressure. Helena remembered her own struggle, what it was like to be underestimated. She decided that she couldn't afford to hesitate. She joined the group and started helping out wherever she could, organizing the materials and making sure everything was on hand for the doctors. The atmosphere was frenetic. The shouts of instructions and rapid orders echoed around the room, but Helena felt determined to make a difference. She was ready to show that she wasn't just an underestimated nurse, she was a vital part of that team. As the team worked frantically, Helena noticed that something was wrong. The patient was not responding to treatment. The doctor in charge, Dr. Martins, began to speed up his orders, but the pressure was clearly mounting. The faces of his colleagues showed concern and apprehension. "We need to stabilize this blood pressure now," Dr. Martins shouted as the others rushed to follow his instructions. Helena, with trembling hands, did what she could to ensure that all the equipment was working properly. But as she looked at the patient, a feeling of despair began to invade her. The monitors were showing worrying signs and sweat was dripping down her forehead. She remembered Dr. Lucas saying that, at critical moments, calm was crucial. Time seemed to drag on, and in an instant of sudden silence, the patient's heart stopped. The room exploded into chaos. Helena froze for a brief moment, panic paralyzing her as the doctors tried to revive the young man. "Start compressions," Dr. Martins ordered, and the team quickly mobilized. Helena joined in the effort, her heart beating fast. She applied chest compressions with all the strength she had, but the reality of the situation hit her. The patient was dying. A wave of helplessness washed over her as she fought back tears. "Please don't," she murmured, the desire to save that young man mingling with her growing frustration. After minutes that seemed like hours, Dr. Martins finally raised his hands. "I'm sorry we couldn't do it. He didn't make it." The words fell like a weight on everyone in the room. The regret was palpable, but for Helena, the pain was even more intense. What could she have done differently? What had she failed to do? She felt guilty, as if she had failed in her responsibility. As the team dispersed, Helena became paralyzed. Sadness and frustration overflowed her heart. A nurse passed by her side, but Helena didn't hear the words of consolation. Instead, an inner voice began to shout, "You're not good enough. Look what's happened. You can't save anyone." Feeling like she was in a nightmare, she walked away from the room and isolated herself in a dark corner of the hospital. The weight of guilt crushed her, and the tears flowed without her being able to control them. How could she continue working in a place that seemed to be filled with loss and despair? The idea of continuing to fight seemed an impossible task. It was at that moment that Marissa, the head nurse, found her. The look on Marissa's face was one of concern, but also frustration. "Helena, you need to pull yourself together. You can't let this affect you so much. We all face loss." "But I couldn't save him," Helena whispered, her voice shaking. "I was there and I couldn't do anything. Sometimes, no matter how hard you try. Medicine has its limitations," Marissa replied, trying to be firm. But Helena saw in her eyes a lack of understanding, a disconnection. Marissa was there but not really present. What Helena needed was empathy, not harsh words. Over the next few days, the loss of the young patient remained etched in Helena's mind, and the emotional pressure began to build. The work routine became a constant struggle against guilt and anxiety. Every time a new patient arrived, the shadow of what had happened accompanied her. She felt like she was walking on a tightrope, always at risk of falling. Meanwhile, Dr. Lucas' recovery was not progressing as expected. The hospital was full of uncertainty, and Helena began to notice that tensions within the team were rising. People began to wonder if he would ever be able to take up his duties again. And with that, the fear of repercussions and the pressure on the nurses and doctors increased. The atmosphere in the hospital was thick, and Helena felt that relationships were permeated by a growing fear of failure. Frustration and loneliness consumed her, and the line between her determination and her vulnerability seemed thinner by the day. Deep down in her heart, Helena knew she was on the edge. And what had begun as an act of care was quickly turning into an emotional battlefield, where she was fighting not only for her patients, but also for herself. The atmosphere in the hospital became unbearable for Helena. The corridors that once pulsed with life and hope now seemed to echo with the lament of recent loss. The smell of disinfectant and the sound of the monitors seemed to intensify her anguish. She felt more and more like an outsider among her co-workers, and the isolation slowly consumed her. At first, Helena tried to force herself to join in conversations, to smile and interact with others. But with each attempt, it was as if an invisible wall had been erected between her and the rest of the team. The lament of the young patient's death echoed in her mind, and the feeling of guilt followed her like a persistent shadow. You're not good enough. You shouldn't be here. These internal voices became her constant companion, sabotaging any attempt at self-confidence. The days passed and the pressure in the hospital only increased. With Dr. Lucas' recovery not unfolding as expected, many began to question his ability to lead. The complicit looks between the doctors and nurses seemed to reinforce the idea that they were waiting for her to fail, just like the young patient. On a particularly difficult day, Helena was called into a meeting with Marissa. She entered the room with her heart in her throat. Marissa's expression was grave, and Helena immediately sensed that something was about to change. Helena, we need to talk about your performance, began Marissa, her voice firm. We all face losses and challenges, but what happened recently seems to have affected you more deeply. I'm worried. Helena swallowed, her hands sweating. I'm fine, just a bit tired, she lied, but there was no sincerity in her voice. Marissa continued. The truth is that you've drifted away from the team. You're not participating as you used to. Your hesitation could be seen as a lack of confidence, and that could affect not just you but the whole team. Those words hit her like a blow. Helena wanted to scream, she wanted to explain that it wasn't a lack of confidence, but a real fear of failing again. I'm just processing everything. What happened to that patient was too much for me, she finally managed to say, her voice shaking. Marissa arched her eyebrows. I understand. But you need to understand that, in this job, life and death are constantly at stake. If you're not ready to deal with that, you might want to consider taking a break. Those words cut her like a blade. Helena felt a wave of indignation and sadness. You want me to walk away? I can't. I'm a nurse, I love what I do. She raised her voice, frustration overflowing. Nobody's saying you're not a good nurse, Helena, Marissa replied, calmer. But you need to take care of yourself. We can't have someone here who isn't mentally present. Leaving the room, Helena felt lost. The doubts she already had about herself were now becoming more concrete. What if Marissa was right? What if she wasn't good enough? The thoughts haunted her. She felt as if she was being evaluated with every move, every interaction. Daily interactions with her classmates became even more difficult. Every laugh, every conversation felt like a reminder of her inadequacy. When she came across Dr. Lucas in the ICU, who was now slowly recovering, Helena didn't know how to feel. He seemed so far away, and the words she had tried so hard to say to him now stuck in her throat. One day, while organizing supplies in the infirmary, Helena heard laughter in the distance. Looking up, she saw a group of nurses chatting, exchanging stories and smiles. What could have been a moment of joy turned into a knot in her stomach. She wasn't part of that group. She never would be. Her estrangement was becoming more and more evident. During breaks, Helena isolated herself in a corner, avoiding conversations and meals with the others. The pressure to be present and show strength seemed suffocating, and the environment that was supposed to offer comfort became a prison. She remembered Paul and his attempts to encourage her to open up. Why don't you listen to me? I want to help you. He would say, but Helena felt unable to share her pain. How could she explain to him the complexity of her internal struggle? How could she put into words the mixture of guilt, sadness and uncertainty that consumed her? With each passing day, the doubt deepened. The feeling that she no longer had control over her life and work made her feel lost. She began to question her choice to become a nurse. Do I really belong here? Was a thought that haunted her, and the answer seemed further and further away. The internal crisis was intensifying. The hospital, which was supposed to be a place of healing and compassion, had become a battlefield where her insecurities showed in every action, every furtive glance. The weight of expectations and the reality of her own failings made her feel unable to stand up. Then, one rainy morning, as the first rays of light began to illuminate the city, Helena was faced with a difficult decision. Whether to continue fighting in an environment that seemed to have no room for her or whether it was time to consider a break, a way out, perhaps even a new direction. The battle was intensifying, and Helena needed to find a way to deal with it. The days became an emotional whirlwind for Helena. Insecurity accompanied her at every turn, while she struggled to avoid the pressure and criticism she constantly felt. The hospital, which had once been a place for learning and growth, had now become a labyrinth of loneliness and doubt. But in the midst of all this, something unexpected was about to happen. After the surgery, Dr. Lucas was transferred to his room, where his recovery began. He looked more frail than she remembered, but there was a determination in his eyes that intrigued Helena. Even though he was weak, his presence was comforting, and without thinking, she decided to visit him in his room. When Helena entered, soft morning light filtered through the curtains, and Dr. Lucas looked at her with a surprised look. "Helena," he said, his voice still weak. "How are you?" She hesitated before answering. "I'm trying to stay strong," she said, her words sounding empty. She sat down in the chair next to the bed, trying to find the courage to talk about what was tormenting her. Dr. Lucas watched her intently. "You know, everyone has bad days. It's not just you. And I, in a way, understand the pressure you're under." His words hit her hard. For someone who always seemed to be in control, Dr. Lucas was opening up in a way that surprised her. "You don't have to be perfect, Helena. Nobody is," he continued, with a sincerity that made her heart squeeze. "But I feel like I'm failing," she admitted, her voice trembling. "What happened to the patient? It haunts me. I should have done more." He sighed as if absorbing her despair. "I know it's hard. But you did your best, and that should be enough. You're a talented nurse, and sometimes what happens outside our control isn't your fault." Helena felt tears welling up in her eyes, the internal struggle she had been going through beginning to dissipate with his words. What he was saying seemed to touch a part of her soul that she had thought was lost. "Do you really believe that?" she asked, almost in a whisper. Dr. Lucas nodded. "Yes, I do. And honestly, I didn't remember you being so strong until I found myself in a vulnerable position. You took care of me in a way I didn't expect. That's not something you should underestimate." His words were like a balm for her wounds. She wanted to believe, but the doubt was still there, like a shadow. "What if I can't go on? What if I fail again?" He paused, looking into her eyes. "Life is full of uncertainties, Helena. And what matters is not the fall, but how we get up. I'm here, and you're not alone. Whenever you need me, you can count on me." It was the first time Helena felt that someone saw her, really saw her. The weight that was suffocating her began to dissipate, albeit slowly. The connection that was forming between them was unexpected, but necessary. She began to wonder if, perhaps, that support could help her confront her fears and insecurities. In the days that followed, Helena began to visit Dr. Lucas regularly. Not only did she care for him, but she also found a safe space to share her struggles. He, in turn, always encouraged her to talk about her experiences and fears, helping her to see that she wasn't the only one feeling overwhelmed. The conversations between them were deep, and Helena began to realize that the doctor wasn't just her boss, but someone who really cared. One morning, as they talked about their hopes and challenges, Helena asked Dr. Lucas, "What are you going to do when you go back to work? How will you cope with the pressures?" He smiled softly. "I'll remember that I can't do everything on my own. I'm going to lean on the team, and most importantly, I'm going to allow myself to be vulnerable." Those words sounded like a call to Helena. Being vulnerable. "Do you think that's really possible in our environment?" she asked, doubt still hanging over her. "It's more than possible, it's necessary. We need each other, and that includes admitting when we're struggling." "It's not a sign of weakness but of strength," Dr. Lucas replied, his conviction clear. As time passed, Helena began to see the light at the end of the tunnel. The pain of the loss was still there, but the connection she was developing with Dr. Lucas seemed to open up a new path to healing. He became an unexpected support, a source of encouragement that made her feel less isolated in her struggle. Finally, in one of their conversations, Dr. Lucas commented, "Helena, when you go back to the hospital, remember that you have a voice. And whatever happens, you are valuable to this team." His words resonated in her heart, creating a new space for hope. Over time, Helena's determination to stand up and fight her insecurities began to take shape. The detachment that had consumed her was slowly giving way to a new perspective on her career and her value as a professional. The connection they had formed was not just about the challenges, but also about the power of mutual support. Helena realized that perhaps she was not alone in this battle, and that she could find strength in places she had never imagined. The relationship that was developing with Dr. Lucas was not only a foundation for her recovery, but an opportunity to rebuild confidence in herself and rediscover her love for her chosen profession. The weeks passed and, gradually, Helena began to feel stronger. Dr. Lucas' support was a balm in her emotional journey. In time, she regained her position in the team, determined to face the difficulties and reconnect with her colleagues. However, a mystery still hung over what had really happened on the day of the young patient's death. One day, while reviewing some medical records in the nursing room, Helena noticed something that made her stop. One name caught her eye: Marissa. The notes showed an error in the administration of medication, an error that wasn't mentioned in team meetings. Helena's heart raced. What else didn't she know? Unable to ignore the growing feeling that something was wrong, Helena decided to investigate further. She spoke to colleagues who were present during the patient's care and began to piece together the fragments. The conversations revealed a common concern. Marissa was putting pressure on the team to act quickly, but she wasn't managing the flow of information properly. She was always more concerned about appearance than patient safety, said one of the nurses in a moment of confidence. There was something wrong with the communication that night, but no one dared to question it. The nurse's words resonated with Helena. She remembered her own experience, the stress she had felt trying to meet Marissa's expectations. The microaggressions she had faced now seemed clearer. Not only was Marissa underestimating her, but she was also exposing her to unnecessary risks. The discomfort grew as Helena remembered her interactions with Marissa, how she often disregarded her suggestions and treated her with indifference. The head nurse wasn't just an authoritarian figure. She was a manipulator who put the hospital's reputation above patient safety. With a heavy heart, Helena decided to confront Marissa. The thought of doing so made her nervous, but she knew she had to fight for the truth, not just for herself but for everyone impacted by her leadership. A patient's life was at stake, and that couldn't be ignored. The following afternoon, Helena asked to meet Marissa in her office. The head nurse was busy reviewing reports but looked up, surprised to see her enter. "What do you need, Helena?" she asked, her voice neutral but with a hint of disdain. "We need to talk about what happened to the patient who died," Helena began, trying to keep her voice steady. "I discovered some inconsistencies in the records, and I believe you were aware that something was wrong." Marissa closed her laptop and stared at her, her expression hardening. "What are you implying?" "I'm implying that communication between the team wasn't clear and that you put excessive pressure on all of us," Helena replied, feeling a mixture of fear and courage. "And that could have cost that young man his life." Marissa laughed, but there was no humor in her laugh. "Do you really think that's acceptable? That you can just come here and lay the blame on me? You should know that in our work there are always variables out of control." Helena took a deep breath, her resolve strengthening. "But you also know that you could have prevented this if you had made sure that everyone was informed and ready to act. You weren't just interested in efficiency but in image. And that may have caused this tragedy." Marissa stood up from her chair, the anger evident on her face. "You're exaggerating, Helena. This is absurd. It's not what you're doing with the team and with your career. Don't forget who really controls the situation here." Those words were like a blow. Helena felt her stomach lurch, but she didn't back down. "I'm trying to do the right thing. If you can't see that, maybe you're in the wrong job." The tension between the two women was palpable, and Helena realized that she was standing in a minefield. But she was no longer afraid. "I'm not going to keep quiet. We need to talk about this openly. We can't let it happen again. We can't let your fear of doom come before patient safety." Marissa looked at her, her eyes full of defiance. "You think you're going to bring me down with that? An insignificant nurse like you?" Her words didn't affect her like they had before. Helena had found her voice and was willing to use it. "If I have to, I'll go to the administration. Someone needs to know the truth." Marissa took a step forward, her tone becoming threatening. "Careful, Helena. You could get burned by this." Helena was undeterred. "I'd rather get burned than live with this guilt. It's time to change things." With that, she turned and left the room, her heart racing, but a sense of power enveloping her. Although the future seemed uncertain, Helena knew she had taken a significant step in the right direction. She couldn't change the past, but she had the chance to protect other patients, to ensure that what had happened wouldn't happen again. The truth now stood in her way and Helena was willing to fight for it. The battle against Marissa wouldn't be easy, but she was prepared. With the strength she had found in her friendship with Dr. Lucas, Helena realized that she was not alone. His support and the truth would guide her on this journey. The next morning arrived with an atmosphere of uncertainty. Helena felt like she was on the edge of a precipice, ready to take a leap that could change everything. After the tense conversation with Marissa, her mind was in turmoil, thinking about the possible repercussions of her decision. She knew that what was at stake was bigger than just her position in the hospital. It was the lives of other patients, the safety of her colleagues, and her own integrity. As she walked through the corridors, she felt the weight of her colleagues' stares. Some whispered, others avoided his gaze. The tension in the air was palpable. But at the same time, there was a new determination in his heart. I can't turn back now, he thought. Responsibility for the truth was more important than any fear. That afternoon, Helena gathered her courage and made her way to the hospital administration. The walk to the meeting room seemed endless, but she was determined. As she entered, she met Dr. Lucas, who was waiting for her. He looked worried but also admired her courage. "How are you feeling?" he asked, concern in his eyes. "Nervous," she replied, sighing. "But I feel it's the right thing to do. I can't live with the doubt any longer. If Marissa is putting patient safety at risk, it needs to be addressed." Dr. Lucas nodded, acknowledging the gravity of the situation. "I'm here to support you no matter what. Don't hesitate to speak the truth. And if you need me, I'll be there for you." With these words of encouragement, Helena felt a little stronger. As soon as the meeting began, Helena voiced her concerns about Marissa's management, her methods, and the consequences of the pressure she imposed on the team. Using data, testimonies from colleagues, and the records of the deceased patient, she presented a clear case. As she spoke, her voice became firmer, and determination grew within her. What began as a thread of doubt turned into a robust line of defense. She noticed that Dr. Lucas, next to her, was supporting her with an encouraging look. That connection fed her, and her confidence grew. The members of the administration listened attentively, some taking notes while others exchanged meaningful glances. Helena felt a mixture of relief and anxiety, but she didn't back down. When she had finished, a silence hung in the room as if the weight of the truth had settled in. Finally, one of the directors addressed her. "We thank you for your sincerity, Helena. We will take your concerns seriously. We need to ensure that everyone is in a safe environment in which to work and, above all, that our patients receive the best possible care." The meeting ended, and as she left, Helena felt as if a huge weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She had spoken, she had taken a stand. She had exposed the truth, even though she knew it could have consequences. Now she could breathe a little more freely. Dr. Lucas was waiting for her outside. "You were incredible. I'm so proud of you," he said, his smile lighting up the room. Helena smiled, although she still felt a little overwhelmed. "I just hope it really makes a difference," she replied, her voice full of hope. "It will, Helena. The truth always prevails. You've remembered who you are and why you chose this profession," said Dr. Lucas, his gaze caring and encouraging. Over time, the hospital began to undergo significant changes. Marissa was called in to explain her leadership practices and was eventually removed. The team pulled together, and the work culture began to shift towards a more collaborative and safe environment. Helena felt more connected to her colleagues and more confident in her abilities. But most importantly, by facing her fears, Helena had not only changed the dynamics of the hospital, but had also transformed herself internally. She learned to value herself, to believe in herself, and to recognize that her voice was powerful. Over time, the pain of losing the young patient didn't disappear, but became a part of her journey. Now, Helena used that pain as a source of motivation, a constant reminder that every life was precious and that the safety of patients would always be her priority. One sunny morning, while walking through the corridors of the hospital, Helena noticed that she was feeling more at ease. She sat down for coffee with some colleagues and laughed at the stories they told. The weight of her loneliness was dissipating and hope was beginning to bloom. When she looked at Dr. Lucas, who was working at a nearby table, a smile formed on her lips. The connection they had built was something special and valuable. He turned and returned the smile as if he could read her thoughts. It was a feeling of belonging that she hadn't felt for a long time. Helena's journey was far from over, but she now knew that she had the strength and support to keep going. And that was enough. She was ready to face whatever came with courage and conviction.